What's up, mortals? Neil Ghost here with a question for you. Who are you gonna call? Just kidding. Do you remember the first time you saw Ghostbusters? Well, if you're like me, you don't, because despite the fact that they try to trap and incinerate me, I've been a fan for as long as I can remember, since way back when I was a wee bitty little ghostling and my parents would put me in front of the TV for endless hours of ghost-busting hilarity on repeat. And although its creators have made some questionable decisions in recent years, Ghostbusters has lived in the hearts of millions for nearly 4 decades, with 4 movies, multiple animated series, and countless books, fan films, costumes, clothing, toys, games, and pop culture references dedicated to those bumbling busters of ghosts. The multi-billion-dollar franchise has become one of the greatest success stories in entertainment history. So being that yours truly happens to be a ghost, I thought it would only be fitting that we kick off the premiere episode of Culturgeist with the history of the greatest ghost story ever told, Ghostbusters. Ghostbusters was the brainchild of comedic actor Dan Aykroyd and was co-written by Harold Ramis. Released in June of 1984, it centers around 4 seemingly average guys living in New York City and running a business as Ghostbusters for hire, trapping and disposing of ghouls and poltergeists as the city becomes overrun by them. It starts with just 3 protagonists: parapsychologist Ray Stantz, Egon Spangler, and Peter Venkman. Very relatable guys despite being scientists and doctors in their field, which is largely what makes the characters and the film itself so appealing. They decide to create their ghost-catching business after being forced out of Columbia University, their previous place of employment. Then they hire Winston Zeddemore, the 4th Ghostbuster, after he responds to a help wanted ad they put in the paper, Winston being a great addition to the team. However, since he's not one of the founding members and shows up part of the way through the movie, this caused his character to be left out of much of the original promotional material for the film. Personally, I was always a bit bothered by this. While it's true that the movie starts with only the original 3 guys, Winston is just as much a Ghostbuster as the rest of them by the end and plays one of the most important roles on the screen, as the normal blue-collared everyman the audience can relate to with a down-to-earth attitude and no real understanding of paranormal activity, but also having no aversion to any of the weird crazy stuff they encounter. He ain't afraid of no ghost. Plus, he delivers some of the best lines in the film from the moment he's interviewed, when he's being asked by Secretary Janine Melnitz if he believes in a wide variety of supernatural creatures and phenomenon, and he replies,
"If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say."
The foursome work out of an old firehouse that doubles as a storage facility for the ghosts they capture, which they hold inside an ecto-containment system located in the basement of the building.
Ghost is incarcerated here in our custom-made storage facility.
Their first major client, Dana Barrett, hires them after coming in contact with a demon named Zool in her apartment building. They later realize the building itself is a gateway to a demonic dimension. A demon named Gozer, ruler of Zool and the other ghosts in the film, wants to destroy the world and attempts to use the building and the possessed bodies of Dana and her neighbor Lewis, as well as all the ghouls it unleashes on the city to accomplish this task. Because of the massive influx of terrifying specters, business ends up going pretty well for the guys. The first ghost they capture is a nasty one named Slimer, originally named Onionhead, who would end up being the most popular recurring creature of the franchise, and was said by Aykroyd to have embodied the spirit of his late friend and fellow comedic actor John Belushi. Once the Ghostbusters reach peak popularity after many successful jobs, a representative of the Environmental Protection Agency, Walter Peck, comes to confront them about what he sees as a potential violation of environmental law. He forces them to shut down the ecto-containment system, which releases all of their captured spirits and causes chaos in the city. And eventually the Ghostbusters are called upon to travel to the roof of the haunted apartment building, where there's a portal from which Gozer and all the other terrifying creatures came. There they attempt to battle Gozer, who initially takes the form of a woman, but then transforms into a building-sized Stay Puft Marshmallow Man in an attempt to destroy them and the city. However, the Ghostbusters luckily managed to save the day once again. Stay Puft would also end up being a highly recognized and marketable character from the franchise, one that, similar to Slimer, would lead to a lot of merchandise being sold. Originally, Aykroyd had a much greater plan for the film, imagining he and his friend and fellow SNL alum John Belushi would play the lead characters as a duo, traveling through other dimensions to battle the ghoulish creatures. However, due to John Belushi's untimely death in 1982, and the fact that this idea would require a much larger budget than what was available, Aykroyd had to change the concept to something more financially feasible, with the help of director Ivan Reitman, who's known for his work in films like Animal House, Kindergarten Cop, and Private Parts, and actor Harold Ramis, who would play Egon in the film. Dan Aykroyd has said in interviews that he originally got the idea for Ghostbusters from his great-grandfather, who had a fascination with the paranormal and the concept of consciousness surviving after death. His grandfather would keep journals of his research on mediumship lying around the house, and one day Aykroyd began reading through them. It was then that he thought it would be cool to make a Bob Hope, Abbott and Costello 30s-style comedy about ghost chasers. His grandfather had done so much research on the topic that he felt there was enough there to make a great film, and has even said that's where he first heard of the term ectoplasm, the visible substance believed by real paranormal researchers to emanate from the body of a spiritualistic medium during communication with the dead, which is heavily referenced in Ghostbusters, even being the inspiration for the name of their vehicle, the Ecto-1, a 1959 Cadillac ambulance hearse combo, another well-recognized element of the franchise. Ectoplasm was also the term that inspired their previously mentioned ecto-containment system. So with his grandfather's notes and after multiple revisions between 1981 and 83, Aykroyd and Ramis ended up with an approximately 150-page script that would eventually come to be known as Ghostbusters. The only problem was, the name Ghostbusters was already taken by a production company that made a show in the mid-70s featuring two wacky guys and their pet gorilla hunting for spooky creatures. A much different concept from the franchise many now know and love. So after testing some other names,
Ghoststoppers! Ghostbusters!
and paying the original owners for the rights, they finally landed on Ghostbusters. The part of Peter Venkman, which was originally meant for John Belushi, was rewritten to instead be played by another SNL and Second City alum, Bill Murray. The part of Winston Zeddemore was written with Eddie Murphy in mind. However, he was forced to turn down the role as he was busy with the first film of his own franchise, Beverly Hills Cop. So it would instead go to Ernie Hudson, a serious actor and the only of the foursome not known for a comedy background. Sigourney Weaver, best known for playing Ripley in the Alien franchise at the time and known for many other famous characters later on, was chosen to play Dana Barrett, the first customer of the Ghostbusters and love interest of Peter Venkman. And for the part of Louis Tully, Dana's goofy neighbor in the haunted apartment building, John Candy was approached, but ultimately turned down the role as his idea of the character was much different from what director Ivan Reitman had in mind.
John didn't get it, and we got into the very uncomfortable conversation, and finally, it was clear that he was not going to do it.
The role would instead go to Rick Moranis of Spaceballs and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids fame. According to Reitman, Moranis is quoted as saying,
"Please thank Candy for turning this down. This is amazing. I know what to do with this."
For the part of the Ghostbusters secretary, Janine Melnitz, Annie Potts was chosen, who would go on to star as Mary Jo Shively in the hit sitcom Designing Women and would voice Bo Peep in the Toy Story films, as well as playing many other supporting roles on the large and small screen. Filming for the movie would start in October of 1983 and would wrap up in February of the following year, as they had to prepare for their June 1984 release. And when it premiered, it was well received by critics and fans alike, earning $282 million during its initial theatrical run and making it the highest grossing comedy film ever at the time, as well as only one of 4 films to gross more than $100 million that year. Later releases would increase that total to nearly $300 million. It held the #1 spot in theaters for 7 consecutive weeks and would go on to be not only one of the most successful comedies of the 80s, but of all time. And the Ghostbusters theme song, performed and produced by Ray Parker Jr., would also reach #1. Some people who see the movie for the first time now don't get the hype, which I suppose I understand, but personally I feel it still holds up. The special effects were done in a way that don't look cheesy even by today's standards. The story is great, the jokes, although dry, can still make you laugh, and I could be biased, but I think this is one of those movies that just doesn't really ever get old. Plus, how can you not want to get down when you hear that ghost-busting beat? With a legion of fans clamoring for more of the Busters, Columbia hoped to make a sequel to capitalize on the film's popularity. But the next project for the franchise would come in the form of an animated series called The Real Ghostbusters, which ran from September of 1986 to October of 1991 and was produced by Columbia Pictures Television. It was created as an extension of the original Ghostbusters story and aired on ABC as part of their Saturday morning cartoon lineup until moving to weekdays once the show entered syndication. It featured many characters from the movie, including all the original Ghostbusters, Janine, Lewis, and Slimer. However, it does not feature or make any mention of Dana Barrett. And because the name Ghostbusters was again already taken during development by another cartoon based on that same live-action TV show which originally owned the name, they chose to put real in the title. They legally had the rights to use the original name again, but were irritated by the fact that the Filmation production company made a show using it, most likely in an attempt to capitalize on the fame of the Ghostbusters movie. So as a sort of jab at Filmation and to make it known to fans that this was the show which actually featured the characters from the film they knew and loved, they figured they would let it be known that these were in fact the real Ghostbusters. The cartoon closely played off the original story from the movie, although some things were changed, like the look of some of the characters, the color of their suits, and the fact that Slimer was no longer a foe, but rather more of a pet or mascot to the crew, joining them in the firehouse and on their adventures. Most of these changes are explained in episode 11 of the series, titled Citizen Ghost. Slimer would also end up being an even bigger character in the show after the third season, when it was retitled Slimer and the Real Ghostbusters and was extended from 30 minutes to an hour, with the second half featuring multiple animated shorts focusing on Slimer. He would be featured as the mascot of the Ghostbusters High C flavor, Ecto Cooler, as well, the only flavor I drank as a kid, and the Real Ghostbusters cartoon would also serve as the basis for multiple comic book series published by Now Comics and Marvel in 1988, as well as an extremely popular line of toys made by Kenner, many of which I owned. The toys included action figures of all the Ghostbuster characters with proton packs, plus Slimer, Stay Puft, and many other ghost creatures for them to capture. However, most of the ghost creatures were kinda lame and didn't actually come from the series or the movie. They also sold the Ecto-1, a flying Ecto-2, plus containers of ectoplasm, and best of all, the Firehouse playset, which had grates built into the floors and ceiling so you could pour your ectoplasm through the roof and watch it ooze through each level of the building. It was so cool. The only problem was, once you tried it once, it kind of hardened on there and ruined the toy in a way. It did mine anyway, but that certainly didn't stop me from continuing to play with it. They also had plastic replica proton packs, ghost meters, trappers, zappers, and poppers so you could LARP as your favorite character, as well as plushies, Play-Doh sets, and countless nonsensical styles and suits of the action figures that had nothing to do with the show, an obvious attempt to milk the fans for every possible penny, similar to the Ninja Turtle figures at that time. Sadly, I was one of the young dopes who bought into this gimmicky crap, but I still loved it, even though I remember thinking none of it made sense, and nothing was as good as the original toy line. Although most of the main characters from the film were featured in the animated series, none of them would be voiced by the original actors. Ernie Hudson did audition to play the voice of Winston, however he lost the part to Arsenio Hall, who's best known for his role in Coming to America and as the host of the Arsenio Hall Show. But he was later replaced by Buster Jones, a well-established voice actor having worked on projects like Spider-Man, G.I. Joe, and Transformers. Spangler was voiced by Maurice LaMarche, a well-known voice actor who has worked on nearly every major animated series over the last 4 decades and still lends his voice to many major projects today. Peter Venkman was voiced by Lorenzo Music, who was known best at the time as the voice of Garfield. However, it's been said that he was fired because Bill Murray thought he made the voice sound too much like Garfield and not enough like him. The role was then handed to Dave Coulier, Uncle Joey from ABC's Full House. Coincidentally, Bill Murray would end up voicing Garfield in 2 live-action movies for the character just over a decade later. Ray Stantz was voiced by Frank Welker, also a very accomplished voice actor who has lent his voice to a wide range of series and films over 5 decades, most notably multiple characters from the Transformers franchise and many other franchises that overlap with the work of LaMarche, Music, and Jones, including Garfield, The Simpsons, Animaniacs, and Futurama. The Real Ghostbusters was loved by kids and praised by critics. It was nominated for 3 Daytime Emmys, although it didn't win any, and continued to air on multiple networks and syndication long after the show's cancellation. Multiple versions of DVD box sets were released from 2009 to 2017, featuring all 140 episodes and the Slimer episodes, which you can still find available for purchase today. Many seasons and episodes of the show were also made available on platforms like Netflix, YouTube, and Crackle since 2017, although Netflix has since removed them, and at the time of making this video, most episodes have been removed from all other platforms as well. I personally remember grabbing a big bowl of cereal as a kid and watching this show regularly, and after watching a few episodes again recently, it definitely holds up. I'm sure kids today, as well as many adult Ghostbuster and animation fans, would still find it very entertaining. Because of the wild success of the real Ghostbusters, as well as the original movie, Columbia Pictures pushed heavily for a sequel to the film. When they initially approached Reitman and the cast, many were reluctant to take part in a sequel, although Dan Aykroyd said in interviews at the time that he was excited to continue the story and even hoped to do more than one sequel as long as there was a demand for the characters to reunite. Given that the real Ghostbusters series kept an interest in the franchise over the years, there was definitely still a demand. So in 1988, Ramis and Aykroyd got to work on a new script. After multiple drafts and convincing all of the original cast members, including Murray, who was the most reluctant to return, filming began in New York in that same year in November of 1988. Filming in New York lasted only 67 days. The remainder of the shoot took place in LA, with principal photography wrapping after 13 weeks. The special effects team was working on scenes until just a month before the project was set to release, with an original date of July 23, 1989. However, director Ivan Reitman asked the studio to push the date back to a June release since another major film was set to premiere on July 23rd. Tim Burton's Batman, the first serious take on the character in film and the highest grossing movie of that year if you include video sales, even eclipsing the original Ghostbusters as the fourth highest grossing movie of the decade, behind Star Wars and E.T. So with the pushback release date, the special effects crew was under immense pressure, even having to drop and replace a scene from the final product that they didn't have time to finish. But on June 18, 1989, the fearless foursome made their return to theaters. The second film would see the Ghostbusters a few years after the events of the first, now plagued with legal troubles and having been forgotten by the public. The movie begins with Winston and Ray doing birthday appearances for unamused children, who taunt them with chants for He-Man.
My dad says you guys are full of crap and that's why you went out of business.
While Peter is busy hosting a strange show called World of the Psychic. Dana also returns in the sequel, now a single mom with a newborn child whom she had with someone other than Peter after having broken things off with him in the time between the two films. After experiencing another paranormal encounter, this one involving her son Oscar, she contacts Egon to investigate the situation, and this leads to the Ghostbusters, as well as Dana and Venkman getting back together while the city is once again being terrorized by ghouls. This time the creatures are powered by a river of psychomagnetheric slime flowing beneath the city, which is fueled by human emotion and also gives power to the antagonist of this film, Vigo the Carpathian, an ancient 16th century medieval tyrant who returns to modern day New York in the form of a painting that's being restored by an admirer and associate of Dana's named Janos, played by Peter McNichol. Janos, under Vigo's control, attempts to kidnap Dana's baby Oscar and facilitate Vigo's rebirth in human form, until the Ghostbusters battle and stop him, once again saving the day. Janine and Lewis also return in this movie, as does Slimer, although he was only added briefly, basically as a cameo appearance to appease the fans who had grown to love him in the animated series. Lewis is now not only the accountant for the Ghostbusters, but their lawyer as well.
This one time I turned into a dog and they helped me.
And in this film, Janine has a much different style than the first. She's now sporting a bright red bob cut wig with hideous bangs, thick black round glasses, and a more wild style of dress, rather than the short wavy brown haircut, thinner large pink rimmed glasses, and more toned down clothing style from the first movie. Most likely this change was done to match the appearance of the character in the 5th season of the animated series, which would premiere just a few months after the release of the movie. In this season of the show, she had this same style. Oddly though, this was the third look for the animated character after having been changed twice by producers through seasons 1 and 4. And 2 more times, once for the regular show and the Slimer shorts. It's funny when I look back at these movies now, because until making this video, the version of Janine that stands out in my mind is the one from the second movie. My memory was probably influenced by the animated series, having been a fan, or maybe just by the fact that being the second film, it's more recent in my memory. And also, if I remember correctly, the sequels seemed to appear much more often on TV back in the day, probably because it was cheaper for the networks to get the rights. In fact, while making this video, I was a bit surprised to see how toned down Janine looked in the original film compared to how I remember her, which was closer to her appearance in the sequel. But looking back now, her style in the first film was actually much better in my opinion. They should have chosen to stick with that look rather than trying to adapt the character to the animated series, which also was worse than the previous animated version of the character.
Typical.
Ghostbusters 2 did not receive the same rave reviews as the first film. While some fans liked it, many were disappointed and had negative opinions. Those of the critics were even worse.
It stinks.
The biggest gripe from most being that it didn't have the same comedic energy of the original and seemed rushed, which makes sense because it was. Siskel and Ebert, the two biggest film critics at the time, claimed that the writers brought nothing new to the franchise with the sequel other than a baby and didn't try to do anything special this time around.
That was just another pointless sequel that didn't have to be made.
Bill Murray has even said that he isn't a fan of the film, claiming that the original script was different when he initially signed on. Then after arriving on set to begin filming, he realized they had changed things and was unhappy, but had no choice to back out. Ultimately, this movie was viewed as one of those sequels that brought down the quality of a franchise rather than lifting it. Many, including Aykroyd himself, have felt they simply waited too long to create the sequel, having built the anticipation and excitement of the fans for half a decade, especially considering the popularity of the animated show. The expectations of fans were raised to a level so high they were nearly impossible to meet. Despite the mixed reviews though, the film was a box office success, grossing over $200 million worldwide and becoming one of the top 10 highest grossing films of 1989. The soundtrack single from this film, On Our Own by Bobby Brown, was also a hit. Not that Bobby Brown. Crack-smoking, wife-beating husband of Whitney Houston Bobby Brown. It wasn't as big as the original theme by Ray Parker Jr., but still reached number 2 on the Hot 100 chart, where it stayed for 3 weeks. The movie also featured multiple versions of the classic Jackie Wilson hit Higher and Higher in 2 scenes which in my opinion serve as some of the best in the film. Maybe I'm just fanghosting, but I thought the concept of controlling the slime with the positive vibes of the music was genius, and the song, while not an original to the movie, is great. They use it in one scene where they find out the slime can make a toaster dance while playing the song, and another where they use it with the slime to control the Statue of Liberty via a controller pad from the original Nintendo Entertainment System. Most likely product placement for Nintendo, seeing as how the Mario Brothers are also referenced earlier in the movie.
So you want to play Super Mario Brothers?
Or possibly an attempt to remind kids, hey, we have another Nintendo game coming out, Ghostbusters 2, the video game, which would hit stores less than a year later and serve as a sequel to the first computer game, which came out in 1984 and was eventually ported to the Atari 2600, Master System, and Commodore 64, as well as the NES in 1988. Neither game was received well by fans, but I remember playing them, especially with the Game Genie that one of my friends owned, which unlocked all the cheat codes, and I loved them. Cruising around in the Ecto-1 busting ghosts while listening to dope 8-bit versions of Ghostbuster tracks was awesome. Jumping over giant holes in the streets? At least in my young mind it was. And in another connection to Nintendo, Ernie Hudson also made an appearance that year in the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, which would often have guests during live action scenes cut between animated stories about the Mario Brothers. Overall, my personal opinion of the Ghostbusters 2 movie is a positive one. I like that it's sort of similar to the first one, rather than being some drastically different story taking place in Scotland, which was one of the original ideas that ultimately got canned. It takes place in New York again, which is cool. I love the use of the Statue of Liberty with the Nintendo controller, although many people think the concept is kinda corny. The good vibes of the music combined with the symbol of liberty, the Ghostbusters, and Nintendo in front of a New York City backdrop is awesome. What's not to love? Also, it had pretty good special effects that in my opinion have held up over 3 decades later, and a lot of the imagery was cool, with the pink tunnel of slime and the heads on spikes. You get to see all your favorite characters again in the movie, played by the same actors, which is always a good thing, and the concept of the slime is creative and done in a unique way. Also, it's a great use of the Lewis character, having him be the lawyer and becoming a Ghostbuster himself to try to save the day at the end. Vigo the Carpathian is kind of a lame character, but the idea of him being trapped in the painting and using the body of a child to return in human form was a good follow-up concept to the original. Plus, it's a redemption story as they reunite and rise again after falling out of favor with the public. Although it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense how people in the movie would view them as anything less than heroes, given the events of the first movie, you know, them stopping a gigantic Godzilla-sized marshmallow from destroying the city and all, not to mention the countless terrifying poltergeists they eliminated. The only other criticism I have is the Janos character. His horrible accent and the fact that he for some reason turns into a flying elderly ghost lady at one point to kidnap the kid never really made sense to me. But despite that, I think it's a decent sequel, and contrary to what many think, including Siskel and Ebert, it's funny. When Lewis gets on the bus to try and save the Ghostbusters and realizes Slimer is driving, and then after Slimer waves him on, he says,
"Okay, but I didn't know you had your license."
I laugh at that every time. And there are plenty of other funny moments throughout the film, from the very beginning when the kids are cheering for He-Man. Even if it's not absolutely hilarious, neither was the first movie really, and when I was little I always viewed these more as great supernatural sci-fi movies with a bit of humor, rather than great comedies with supernatural themes. Similar to Back to the Future, I always viewed that as a really great but also funny sci-fi movie, rather than a comedy about time travel. I mean, as a kid, I think the only thing I really understood from the first movie was the one dick joke.
This man has no dick.
But maybe my positive opinion just comes from a place of nostalgia, or the mind of the immature child I was when I saw it 50 times, and I was so wildly fascinated by the Ghostbusters I just ignore all the flaws. So what do you think about these movies? Did you ever see the show or play with the games or toys? Let me know in the comments, and make sure you check out part 2 of this series, because this is only half of the history of the greatest ghost story ever told. Thanks for watching, I'll see you there, and until then, live well and take it easy. Later.